Hi, this is a video tutorial on The Handmaid's Tale, and it gives some historical context into which the book was written and also some background information about Margaret Atwood that would be helpful to understanding the book. To begin with, Margaret Atwood has called this book a work that is called speculative fiction. So this is a genre that she's kind of invented and labeled and named. So she doesn't view this as science fiction. She doesn't view it as dystopian fiction. She views it as speculative fiction. And by this, she means that nothing in this book is really made up in this world. Everything has happened before. And she is kind of speculating or imagining, like, what if? Um, and this what if is what if really, really extreme Christians um, took over the United States. Like, what would that look like if the United States became a theocracy? Okay. And at the time, we'll kind of look at this later, but at the time, there were rising theocracies around the world, mostly centered around Islam and kind of an extreme view of Islam. But she was imagining what would happen in the United States if people who said that we're a Christian nation, we need to be ruled by Christian values. Like, what if they were in charge? And so, if you as you go through the book, like you have to keep in mind that everything in the book has actually happened before in history. Now, has there ever been a Republic of Gilead that is exactly like depicted in the book, that all these things were happening all at the same time? No, of course not. But Margaret Atwood is taking like real historical things and using them within her book. So it's as you're reading, you don't need to be like, oh, that would never happen, because it has. Okay, so let's look at the historical context of the 1980s and what's kind of influencing her and what this book is a response to. First of all, there was increasing infertility, and we have looked at this in class and we will a little bit more, but male sperm counts in the Western world have gone down so much in the past several decades. So there was an awareness of this. Female infertility was impacted as well. And because it was so impacted in the Western world, there was really a ties to this infertility to uses of chemicals and like chemicals in our food, chemicals in our products that we're using, chemicals that were used in farming practices, um, house cleaning, all those things. There are ties to this, the use of them to infertility. And Margaret Atwood was imagining, like, what if infertility was such a huge issue that it started kind of creating a huge feeling of mistrust and anger and instability. There were also nuclear disasters, especially in the 1970s, but there were in 1980s. So you had in the United States, like 3 Mile Island, which could have been a lot worse than it was, but it was really scary. You also had things like Chernobyl in Russia and how that impacted things. And so there were a lot of birth defects caused by Chernobyl in particular. So Margaret Atwood is kind of imagining, what if this is impacting fertility also and impacting babies that are being born in a society. We also had the AIDS epidemic at the time, and when AIDS was first discovered, there wasn't a lot known about it, and just it formed a lot of fear, and people reacted sometimes with violence toward others out of that fear, right? And they reacted by stereotyping groups of people in really negative ways as well. You also had the Cold War from really the 1950s through the 1980s. So the Cold War was like this imaginary war, but this real tension between communism and capitalism. So after World War II, Russia and the United States had been allies in that war, and they had worked together. But after the war, they had to divide all the things they won, And as they were making those divisions, they really saw each other as having an opportunity to become a global superpower, and they saw themselves as enemies competing for that title. And both countries really turned this into a propaganda thing, where they were vying for power by demonizing the other side. The United States got into wars over this, the Vietnam War, the most famous, to try to keep the spread of communism from happening. Um, and so Margaret Atwood, when she was writing this book, she was living in West Germany. Germany had been split into two. The United States occupied the western part, Russia occupied East Germany, and the city of Berlin was kind of a divided city. The Berlin Wall went through the middle of it, and divided those people. And the Western Germany was kind of viewed as the free Germany because it was the capitalistic United States Germany, and East Germany was kind of viewed as not having that kind of freedom. And Margaret Atwood just saw the use of propaganda, the abuse of power, and she also saw like just what governments could do overnight. Putting up a wall and everything changing so quickly within a country. And she was really aware of the fear of what the powers of government could do. Also, during the 1980s, you had this rise of religious extremism, and in countries like Afghanistan and Iran, they had previously been pretty westernized. They had had elected governments. Um, And after World War II, the Middle East kind of got split up. New dividing lines were made, that didn't really follow old tribal lines. So it formed a lot of tensions, and a lot of the Western countries kind of stuck different sects of Muslims together, and told them, go make your government together. And it didn't work. And so there was really, it gave rise and it enabled the rise of religious extremism. And so, Iran is still viewed as a theocracy. And then in Afghanistan, you can still see like the Taliban quickly took over, right? So what was also kind of interesting is, well, interesting, I don't know what word you would use, but at the time in the 70s, the United States backed, and 80s, the United States was backing Osama bin Laden and his group, because his group was fighting against the Russians who had invaded Afghanistan, and we didn't want the communist Russians to take over Afghanistan. So we gave money and help and aid to Osama bin Laden's group, and enabled him to have more power. So the United States sometimes actually backed these kind of religious extremist groups. But then in the United States, there was the rise of religious extremism. And really, this rise came in the well, I mean, it's always kind of existed in America, but in the 1920s with the Scopes monkey trial, there was really this rise of kind of more right-wing fundamentalists in the country, that was really getting involved in politics and wanting to go back to having like this Christian nation. And this became an even more powerful movement in the 1970s in response to shifts in morality, shifts in gender roles, shifts in understanding family. So, divorce had become more common, birth control was more accessible, the, abortion was legalized. Um, Women were working more and more outside the home. You had the feminist movement. You also had the gay rights movement starting, and the religious right really saw these as a threat to the country. And so they wanted to go back to traditional family values and having a Christian country. In the 1970s, there was also an Equal Rights Amendment that was proposed to be added to the Constitution. That amendment would put into law equal rights between men and women. It was passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate and the president, but several states have never ratified it. And so it was not added as an amendment. So um, one of our former Supreme Court justices in recent years said that because of that, women don't actually have equal rights under the Constitution. If that was passed, then they would, but since it hasn't been passed, they don't. But a lot of this religious right movement really fought against the Equal Rights Amendment. They did not believe that women should have equal rights. And there were a lot of women that were fighting for this too. So these women were fighting against equal rights. They wanted traditional family values too. There was a leader named Phyllis Schlafly, who's probably one of the most famous in that movement. But Margaret Atwood was kind of really interested in this idea of women who were fighting against equal rights. And you'll see that in the book as well. And Margaret Atwood also saw a connection between this religious extremism in the United States and the Puritans in the early period of America, and what was happening in American politics. So she understood that this was not new in American politics, this idea that we should be more like a theocracy. And in the Trump administration, President Trump really made use of this kind of religious rhetoric. In fact, one of his press secretaries said that God put him in power to do God's will. So you see that kind of rhetoric. And President Biden kind of made use of a similar, not that exact rhetoric, but President Biden really talks a lot about his beliefs being informed by his Catholic faith, and that he is led by his religious faith. So it's pretty common for political leaders to use that kind of religious rhetoric. Just a few things to know about Margaret Atwood that might be helpful. She's an award-winning poet and novelist. She's written a ton, but The Handmaid's Tale kind of remains her kind of major work that she's most well known for. She's also an English professor. She grew up in Canada, so she's writing as a Canadian, but kind of reflecting on American politics. So she kind of has this a little bit outsider's perspective, which I think is interesting. She did study in the United States for her master's degree at Harvard University. And while there, she studied Puritan literature. So she's really interested in Puritan literature. And her family tree also includes Puritans who fled to Canada because they were British loyalists. So that's a kind of interesting fact as well. Margaret Atwood has really been influenced by American literature, and she was really influenced by a book by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Scarlet Letter, where a woman is really punished severely for having an affair. And we find out later the person she had an affair with is really hypocritical in that society, and he didn't face any kind of punishment. She was also really influenced by 1984, and she and that kind of totalitarian government that's in that book, but also this idea of time and stories and memory end up being really important. How we remember things and how propaganda can change the way we remember things. And Atwood also really admired Mary Webster. Mary Webster was a woman accused by the Puritans of being a witch. She was hung as her punishment for being a witch. This was pretty common. But she survived the hanging. She was still alive the next day. And because of that, the Puritans had rules that if you survived a hanging by the next day, they would take you down. You lived. And because you couldn't be tried twice for the same crime, Mary Webster wasn't tried again for being a witch. She just lived. But then she was kind of ostracized for the rest of her life and treated, especially as a witch, because she survived the hanging. It was like proof of her witchness. But Margaret Atwood is really interested in women that don't really fit into their time period and are separated. And you kind of see that in The Handmaid's Tale as well. Okay, and those are my sources for my images that I used in here. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful.